David Keller had always thought of his job as a kind of stage where he played the same role every day, the quiet, reliable guard who followed the rules and kept his head down. East Ridge Correctional Facility was not a place that encouraged warmth. The walls were tall and gray, the air heavy with disinfectant, and the muted echo of steel doors closing. Years in that environment taught him to avoid seeing the inmates as anything more than names and numbers. That distance was his armor. But Samantha Drew was different. She came into the prison long before David ever spoke to her directly, another face in the yard, another file in the system. She wasn't loud or reckless like some of the others. She carried herself with a steadiness that made her seem apart from the constant churn of the place. While others shouted to each other during yard time, she sat quietly with a book or walked slow laps alone. Her eyes, sharp and deliberate, scanned everything. If you caught her gaze, you got the feeling she'd already made a decision about you. The first time they spoke was nothing, just an offhand comment she made during morning head count about the weather being too cold for spring. David, without thinking, replied. That was it. No extra words, no lingering look. But the next week, she spoke again, and again he responded. The exchanges were so brief they barely registered as conversation, but they began to happen regularly, like a thread woven into the fabric of his day. At first, he told himself it was harmless. She was polite, respectful, even lighthearted at times, a rare thing in a place that often felt tense enough to snap. He never lingered after speaking to her, never let his voice soften too much. Yet he noticed that he looked for her without meaning to, scanning the yard, expecting to see her moving with that deliberate calm. David's life outside work was quiet. His marriage had worn thin over the last few years, the conversations with his wife reduced to logistics and bills. They ate dinner in silence more nights than not. Sometimes, when he left for his night shift, she barely looked up from her phone. He didn't think of himself as lonely, but there was an emptiness there, a hollow space that he kept busy enough to ignore. Samantha had a way of filling that space without trying. She began asking small questions about his favorite music, whether he liked the job, if he'd ever been out west. She never asked anything that crossed a line outright, but her interest was unusual. Most inmates didn't bother to know a guard beyond the uniform. He found himself answering honestly, in short bursts, as though he owed her at least that much for asking. Her story, at least the one she told him in pieces, was one of survival. She spoke about her childhood with a detachment that made the details sharper, moving between foster homes, learning early to read people's moods before they turned dangerous. She'd had boyfriends who hit her, who controlled her, who left her scraping by. The fight that landed her here, she said, was just the last in a long line of moments where she'd been pushed too far. David didn't check her file to compare the details. Part of him didn't want to. He liked the version she gave him, the one where she wasn't the villain but the person who had finally fought back. In a place where trust was a currency no one gave freely, her willingness to share pieces of her life felt like a gift. It wasn't that he forgot she was an inmate. He still carried the keys on his belt, still kept his eyes on the cameras, still knew the rules by heart. But something had shifted in the way he moved through the facility. When he saw her name on the schedule for work detail, there was a small spark of anticipation. When she passed through the checkpoint, he found himself watching longer than necessary. Other guards noticed changes in him, subtle ones. He lingered in certain areas longer, took shifts that put him near her block. No one said anything outright. Camaraderie among guards meant turning a blind eye to the quirks and habits of your coworkers unless they threatened safety. But David could feel their eyes on him sometimes, a quiet kind of awareness that made him straighten his posture, put his guard face back on. Still, the conversations with Samantha continued. She had a way of making the fluorescent-lit hallways feel less oppressive, of breaking the monotony of endless days filled with clanging gates and the shuffle of feet in line. He told himself she was just a bright spot in a dark routine, that nothing about it was dangerous. But when he caught himself thinking about her during his drive home, replaying something she'd said, picturing the way her eyes had locked onto his in the yard, he realized it was no longer just part of the job. Something was taking shape between them, quiet and unspoken, but real enough to leave him restless in the stillness of his own kitchen, wondering when he would see her again. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was no longer nothing. David told himself he was still in control, that the routine with Samantha hadn't changed anything important. But over time, the way he carried himself around her shifted, almost without him realizing. He lingered an extra moment when she passed through the metal detector, gave her a nod in the yard that wasn't part of standard protocol. It wasn't overt enough to draw complaints, but it was enough for a few of the other guards to exchange quiet glances when he was nearby. It started small. An extra carton of milk with her meal tray. A few more minutes in the library when she was supposed to be back in her cell. Things that could be brushed off as harmless if anyone noticed, but he knew they weren't. Those moments were seeds, and they were beginning to root. Samantha never asked for favors directly, but she knew how to leave a gap in a conversation that made it easy for him to step in. One rainy afternoon, she was working laundry detail, her sleeves rolled up, her hands pulling steaming fabric from the industrial dryers. She glanced at him when she thought no one was watching. "These hours make the day go faster," she said. Beats staring at a wall. He agreed without thinking, leaning against the doorway longer than was necessary. She didn't need to say she liked that he stayed. He could feel it. Her stories became more personal. She spoke about the years before prison with a tone that was almost confessional. The boyfriend who once locked her out of their apartment in winter, the night she fought back after being cornered in a parking lot. Her voice carried no self-pity, only a clear-eyed defiance, and it struck something in him. He began to picture her outside the uniform, in another life, in another place. At home, his marriage was unraveling quietly. His wife had stopped asking how his day was. They spoke about bills, groceries, and the dog's vet appointment, but nothing that mattered. When they did fight, it was short and sharp, both of them retreating into separate rooms before anything real could be said. David found himself leaving for work early just to avoid the silence. Samantha filled that silence without ever stepping beyond the boundaries of prison rules, at least not in ways anyone could prove. But in his mind, she was already a confidant. He began to notice her moods, the way her shoulders tensed when she was irritated, the slight upturn of her mouth when she was amused. He memorized the rhythm of her voice, the way it could shift from light to steady in a heartbeat. Once, during a routine cell inspection, he found a folded piece of paper tucked inside one of her books. It wasn't contraband in the dangerous sense, just a short note, written in her neat, slanted handwriting. "The world is bigger than these walls. Remember that." He didn't report it. Instead, he slid it back into the book without a word, and later, when he was alone, he thought about it far longer than he should have. The other inmates noticed, too. Not openly. They were careful about how they moved around guards, but in the small ways people in close quarters signal awareness. A smirk when he walked past her table in the chow hall. A low chuckle from a corner when he assigned her to an easier work detail. He ignored them. Let them think what they wanted. Still, he knew he was breaking an unspoken code among staff. The job was built on the ability to keep emotional distance. Getting too close was dangerous, not just for him, but for the entire chain of authority inside those walls. Yet when she caught his eye across the yard, it felt like a private conversation no one else could hear. One day, during a shift change, she passed him in the hallway and said quietly, "You're different from the rest." She didn't explain what she meant, and he didn't ask. But the words stayed with him, settling somewhere in the back of his mind like a hook. From then on, his decisions tilted ever so slightly in her favor. A shorter search before she entered the library. A delay in writing her up for being late to roll call. Each choice was small enough to justify if questioned, but strung together, they formed a pattern. And while David liked to think he was still steering the course, there were moments, brief but undeniable, when he realized he was reacting to her, not leading. She knew how to draw him in without asking too much at once, how to make him feel like the one in control even as the space between them quietly closed. By the time he recognized it, the lines weren't just blurring, they were nearly gone. The pressure started building in ways David didn't notice at first. It was in the small glances from other guards, the casual mentions in the break room about getting too friendly with inmates, the clipped tone from his supervisor when handing out assignments. No one accused him outright, but he could feel the undercurrent. Samantha had become a part of his workday in a way that was impossible to hide forever. Her influence wasn't loud or obvious. She never pushed him in public, never created a scene. Instead, she planted ideas in his mind, little pieces of a story about what their lives could be outside these walls. She'd talk about beaches she'd never seen, cities she wanted to visit, the quiet fantasy of having a place where no one could tell them when to wake up or when to sleep. It wasn't a direct invitation, but it was enough to make him picture it. At home, things were coming apart faster. His wife's patience had worn thin. They fought over small things, dishes left in the sink, his long hours, the way he seemed distracted even when he was there. Once, during an argument, she accused him of finding someone else. He denied it immediately, but her eyes told him she didn't believe him. The truth was more complicated. He hadn't crossed the line physically, but in his mind, he was already somewhere else. The breaking point came during a minor security incident in the rec yard. Two inmates got into a fight over a stolen radio, and the commotion drew in everyone nearby. Samantha was there, standing close enough to be pulled into it if things escalated. David moved toward her first, guiding her out of the fray before dealing with the others. It wasn't protocol, and one of the other guards noticed. Later that day, he was called into the supervisor's office. The conversation was brief but pointed. There were concerns about his judgment, questions about whether he was letting personal feelings cloud his decisions. He left the office with a warning fresh in his mind. One more misstep, and his job could be in jeopardy. That night, during his patrol, Samantha caught his eye through the bars. She didn't smile. She just said, "You shouldn't have to take orders from people who don't understand you." The words hit a nerve. He'd been feeling it for months. The weight of rules that felt more like chains. The job that once gave him structure now felt like a cage. The idea of leaving had flickered in his mind before, but now it burned brighter. If he quit, there'd be no more scrutiny, no more hiding. They could talk openly, see each other without the barrier of guard and inmate. She didn't have to tell him outright. The thought was already his. Within weeks, he put in his resignation. The official reason was burnout. Too many years in a high-stress environment, too little appreciation. His coworkers nodded knowingly, some offering quiet goodbyes, others keeping their distance. No one pressed for the real reason, though he suspected a few already knew. His last day felt strange. The sound of the gates closing behind him was the same as always, but it carried a different weight. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking back through them the next day. He left the facility with a box of belongings, a couple of framed photos, a coffee mug, and the set of keys he no longer needed. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing in. He'd walked away from steady pay, health benefits, and the only career he'd ever known. But beneath the uncertainty was something else. A pull, a sense that he'd taken the first step toward a life he'd been imagining in pieces for months. Samantha was still behind bars, but the distance between them had changed. He could write her now without breaking rules. He could be on her approved visitor list. They could plan for a future without looking over their shoulders. It felt reckless. It felt dangerous. But it also felt inevitable. When David left East Ridge, the first thing he noticed was the quiet. No clanging gates, no radios squawking, no echo of footsteps in long corridors. It was the kind of quiet that most people would find peaceful, but for him it felt strange, almost hollow. For 8 years, the rhythm of his life had been built around the sound of heavy doors and the steady tick of a shift clock. Now, mornings stretched out with nothing to anchor them. At first, he tried to keep busy. He fixed things around the house that had been sitting on his to-do list for years, repainted the fence, reorganized the garage. But even while he was busy, his mind kept drifting to Samantha. Without the daily contact of the prison, he found himself wondering what she was doing, if she thought about him as much as he thought about her. He started writing to her almost immediately. His first letter was careful, light on details, but personal enough to let her know that leaving the job hadn't meant leaving her behind. She wrote back within a week, her handwriting neat and deliberate. The letter was short, but every sentence felt measured, like each word was chosen for him and him alone. She asked about the world outside, about the changing seasons, about the taste of coffee that didn't come from a cafeteria urn. The letters became a steady current between them. They shared small details about their days, dreams about the future, little jokes that belonged only to them. David began counting time differently, not in shifts or pay periods, but in the space between her letters. He added his name to her approved visitor list, and the first time he saw her across the visiting room table, it was like a current ran through him. Gone were the uniforms that marked him as a guard. They were two civilians now, separated only by a table and the watchful eyes of corrections officers. Their conversations stretched as far as the clock would allow, drifting from the ordinary, movies they wanted to watch, meals they'd cook, to the intimate, the what-ifs and maybes of a life beyond these walls. Her release date was still more than 2 years away, but David began planning as if it were tomorrow. He started looking at apartments in quieter neighborhoods, places with big windows and small kitchens where they could eat breakfast together. He browsed furniture online, saving photos of dining tables and soft armchairs. He put away part of his savings, telling himself it was for travel, but deep down knowing it was for her. Friends noticed the change in him. He spoke less about the prison, more about what was ahead. When he mentioned Samantha, carefully, sparingly, the responses were cautious. "You should be careful," one friend said. Another asked, "Do you really know her?" He brushed off their concerns. They hadn't seen her the way he had. They didn't know the woman who could turn a gray afternoon into something worth remembering with just a few words. In the meantime, Samantha's calls became the highlight of his week. She had a way of making even the shortest conversations feel alive. Sometimes she teased him for working on projects around the house alone, saying he'd have to redo them when she got there. Other times she grew quiet, speaking softly about how much she hated the noise and the walls closing in. Those moments pulled at him harder than anything else. The separation intensified his feelings. He began to see her not just as someone he cared for, but as the missing piece in his life. The thought of her walking out of those gates into his arms became the image that carried him through the days. On nights when the house felt too empty, he'd picture their future in sharp detail. Her unpacking groceries in their kitchen, laughing at a movie on the couch, standing beside him at the sink as they washed dishes together. These images became so vivid that they almost felt like memories waiting to happen. He didn't think about the years she'd spent inside or the reason she was there. In his mind, those were chapters she'd already closed, pages turned in a story that no longer defined her. What mattered was the life they could build now, away from the bars, away from the watchful eyes, in a space that belonged entirely to them. And so he waited, not passively, but with a kind of restless anticipation, counting the months and marking them off like stepping stones toward the day she'd be free. Every letter, every call, every visit tightened the bond between them, until the world outside the prison gates seemed like it was only on pause, waiting for the moment when they could press play together. The morning Samantha walked out of East Ridge was sharp and bright, the kind of day where the air feels freshly cut. David stood near the gate, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. He had imagined this moment so many times in the quiet of his home, but the reality still sent a tremor through him. When she appeared, wearing state-issued clothes and carrying a plastic bag with her few belongings, the noise of the world seemed to narrow into the sound of her footsteps. She smiled when she saw him, a small, almost private expression that didn't belong to the cluster of other people waiting for their own. The hug they shared was brief. There were eyes on them, after all, but it carried a charge that neither could disguise. They walked to his car without speaking much, and when the gates faded in the rearview mirror, she leaned back in the seat, closed her eyes, and exhaled as if she'd been holding that breath for years. The first weeks were a blur of motion. They moved into the small apartment David had rented downtown, with wide windows that spilled sunlight across the floor in the mornings. Samantha marveled at simple things: the sound of water rushing from the tap, the feel of new sheets, the taste of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. They spent afternoons walking through the park, evenings cooking together in a kitchen that was barely big enough for two. David watched her rediscover the world and felt a kind of pride in being the one to show it to her. He bought her clothes that actually fit, took her to restaurants where the menu was a small book instead of a list on a wall. Every moment felt like they were building something solid, a life that was entirely theirs. It didn't take long for the subject of marriage to surface. One night, after a quiet dinner, He brought out a small box he had kept hidden in his dresser. The ring inside was simple but elegant, a silver band with a single stone. He didn't make a speech, just told her he couldn't imagine the future without her. She said yes with a smile that reached her eyes, and for a moment, the rest of the world fell away. The wedding was small, held in a rented hall with soft lighting and a handful of guests. David's friends came out of loyalty, though some kept their distance from the bride. Samantha wore a pale dress that floated around her ankles, and when she walked toward him, he felt certain he was exactly where he was meant to be. The ceremony was short, the vows spoken quietly, almost as if they were meant for no one else to hear. Afterward, there was food and music, the kind you could talk over without raising your voice. David watched her move through the room, her laughter easy, her posture poised. She charmed some of the guests, and others simply watched her, unsure what to make of her. He didn't care about their opinions. In his mind, they were already a unit, bound not just by paper, but by everything they'd shared before she was free. They spent their wedding night in the apartment, the windows open to let in the cool night air. Samantha stood on the balcony for a long time, looking out over the city lights, her hair lifting in the breeze. When he joined her, she leaned into him, and for that moment, it felt as though nothing could reach them from the outside world. In the days that followed, David began to notice the shift in how people looked at him. Neighbors were polite but cautious, friends called less often. He didn't mind. He had chosen this life, and he believed it was worth the distance it created from others. Samantha spoke sometimes about wanting to travel, to see places she'd only read about, and he promised they would, starting with a trip just for the two of them. The honeymoon was his idea, a week away in the mountains, in a secluded cabin where they could be entirely alone. He wanted to give her something that felt like a fresh start, far from the city, far from the past. She agreed easily, her eyes bright with the promise of open space and quiet nights. As they packed for the trip, David felt the same kind of anticipation he'd known when he first started visiting her in prison. It was a mix of nerves and excitement, a belief that they were standing at the edge of something new and unshakable. In his mind, the hardest part of their story was already behind them. The rest would be theirs to write. The road to the cabin wound through long stretches of pine and open sky. David drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely in his lap, stealing glances at Samantha as she watched the scenery blur past. She wore a faint smile, the kind that seemed to drift in and out as the miles rolled on. The further they got from the city, the quieter it became, until it felt like they were the only two people on the road. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was lowering, streaking the sky in shades of gold and pale pink. The place was exactly as David had pictured when he booked it, a wide wooden porch, a stone chimney, the smell of cedar thick in the air. Inside, it was warm and simple, a small living room with a fireplace, a kitchen with worn counters, and a bedroom tucked at the back. The first night felt like the start of something they could build on. They cooked dinner together, the sound of the pan and the soft crackle of the fire filling the room. They sat close on the couch, the kind of closeness that felt natural after all the time they'd spent imagining this life. Later, they stepped outside, the night so dark that the stars seemed to burn brighter than anywhere else. Samantha tilted her head back to look, and for a moment David thought he'd never seen her so still. The days that followed were slow and unhurried. Mornings were spent with coffee on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the chill. They took walks along narrow trails, the ground soft underfoot, the trees standing like quiet witnesses. At night, they cooked, played cards, and sat by the fire. It was the kind of rhythm David had hoped for, simple, steady, just the two of them. But small cracks began to show. Samantha grew restless, pacing the cabin when there was nothing to do. She complained about the lack of cell service, about how far they were from anything. Once, when David suggested they spend the afternoon reading by the fire, she laughed in a way that wasn't unkind but carried an edge. "We didn't come all this way to sit in silence," she said. She started going out on her own during the day, saying she wanted to explore the area. David didn't mind at first. He figured she needed space after years of being confined. But her absences grew longer, and when she returned, she offered little about where she'd been. Her mood would shift quickly, warm one moment, distant the next. One evening, They sat down to dinner after she had been gone for most of the day. David asked where she'd gone, his tone casual but carrying a trace of curiosity he couldn't hide. She shrugged, saying she'd walked into town, though he knew the nearest town was too far for the time she'd been away. When he pressed, just slightly, she set down her fork and looked at him in a way that made his stomach tighten. "Don't start keeping tabs on me," she said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the air. The conversation shifted after that, but something in the room had changed. David tried to smooth it over, to return to the easy rhythm they'd had, but it didn't quite come back. That night, she stayed up late by the fire, staring into the flames long after he'd gone to bed. The next day was cooler, with clouds hanging low over the treetops. They stayed in, making a slow breakfast, the cabin filled with the smell of coffee and toast. By afternoon, the silence between them had grown heavy. David suggested they take a drive to see the lake nearby. She shook her head, saying she didn't feel like going anywhere. It wasn't until dinner that the tension finally broke. What began as a small disagreement, whether to stay in the next day or go into town, swelled into sharper words. David's voice was calm at first, but hers carried an undercurrent that was harder, colder. She accused him of trying to control the trip, of making everything about what he wanted. He told her he just wanted them to enjoy their time, that he was trying to make it perfect for her. Her eyes narrowed in a way he hadn't seen before, the warmth gone from her face. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, and walked into the kitchen without another word. He followed, still trying to defuse whatever this had turned into, but there was a distance in her expression that made him stop mid-sentence. She opened a drawer, her hand moving with a quick, precise motion. When she turned back to him, the knife was in her hand, glinting in the low light. For a second, David didn't fully register what he was seeing. The knife caught the light from the hanging lamp, the steel gleaming as if it belonged in some other place, not here in the kitchen where they had been sharing meals. Samantha held it loosely, but there was nothing casual in the way she looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, almost detached, as though she were watching him from a great distance. He opened his mouth to say something, to ask her what she was doing, to tell her to put it down, but the words didn't come quickly enough. She stepped forward, the movement smooth, and before he could react, the blade was in him. It was not a wild strike. It was deliberate, the point finding the soft place below his ribs, the force enough to steal his breath. Shock came before pain. For a heartbeat, his body didn't understand what had happened. Then the heat bloomed outward, sharp and searing, and his knees weakened. He stumbled back, his hand flying to the wound, feeling the warm rush spill between his fingers. Samantha didn't flinch. She stood there, breathing steady, her gaze fixed on him like she was waiting for something. "What are you?" he managed, but his voice was raw, thin. She cut him off without words, taking another step closer, the knife still in her hand. There was no wildness in her expression, no raised voice, only a strange, cold certainty. David's mind was racing, trying to stitch together the moment with all the ones before it. Every conversation, every smile, every promise they'd made, they felt impossibly far away now, replaced by the immediacy of survival. He backed toward the counter, his free hand searching for something to brace against. She spoke then, but the words made no sense to him. Fragments about freedom, about not being owned, about never letting anyone decide for her again. Her tone was flat, almost conversational, but each sentence was jagged, impossible to hold on to. Pain was clouding his thoughts now, turning the edges of the room soft and unsteady. He tried to steady himself, to keep his eyes on her, to read any sign of what she might do next. But her face was unreadable, and the knife still glinted in her hand. In some distant corner of his mind, he realized she hadn't struck again. She could have, but she didn't. Instead, she turned away, moving with a calm that twisted something deep in him. She set the knife on the counter as though she were done with it, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and walked toward the bedroom. David pressed his palm harder to the wound, feeling the wet warmth soak through his shirt. The air in the cabin felt thick, hard to pull into his lungs. He heard her moving around in the other room, drawers opening, the creak of the floorboards under her steps. When she returned, she had his wallet in one hand and his car keys in the other. She didn't look at him as she passed. The front door opened, letting in a rush of cold air, and then it closed again. The sound of the car starting cut through the stillness, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Then there was nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the uneven beat of his own breathing. He stood there for a long moment, gripping the counter, before his legs gave way and he slid to the floor. The cabin felt impossibly large now, every shadow stretching too far, every sound amplified. The fire in the living room had burned low, the light flickering weakly across the walls. The pain was constant now, sharp with every breath. He tried to think clearly, to remember what he needed to do, but the thoughts kept scattering. Somewhere beneath the panic, a bitter truth settled in. He had never really known her. Whatever version of Samantha he had built in his mind was gone, replaced by the person who had just walked out the door. He thought about the drive they had taken to get here, the quiet mornings on the porch, the nights they had spent talking about the future. All of it felt like a story he had been told, something he believed in because he wanted to, not because it was true. The room tilted slightly as he tried to shift his weight. He needed help, and he needed it soon, but the phone was on the far counter, out of reach. His breathing grew shallower, each inhale feeling like a climb. He told himself to stay awake, to keep his eyes open, but the edges of his vision were darkening. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, the sky heavy with clouds. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch cracked, and the sound made him flinch. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. David pressed harder against the wound, willing himself to move, to reach the door, to get outside. Somewhere in the distance, the last trace of her car's engine faded into nothing. He was alone, and the silence was absolute. The cold from the floor seeped into David's skin, the boards pressing against his shoulder as he lay there, the weight of his own body feeling heavier with each passing minute. He knew that if he stayed down, it would be over. The thought came to him with a blunt clarity that cut through the haze of pain. He had to move. He gritted his teeth, pushing himself upright with one trembling arm. The effort sent a fresh wave of heat from the wound, the wetness spreading under his hand. He staggered toward the door, each step unsteady, his free hand dragging along the wall for balance. The night air hit him like a shock when he stepped outside, sharp and biting against his sweat-damp skin. The gravel beneath his feet felt unstable, every stone shifting as he made his way toward the faint glow from the neighboring cabin. It wasn't close, not nearly as close as he wished, but it was the only point of light in the darkness. His vision narrowed, the trees on either side blurring together as he focused on that distant beacon. He managed a few shouts for help, though they came out hoarse, carried away quickly by the wind. His legs wavered, and more than once he nearly went down. But the light grew larger, and finally, a shadow moved across it. Moments later, a voice called out, sharp with alarm. The neighbor, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face, rushed toward him. "Oh my God, what happened?" The words barely registered. David felt a hand on his arm, steadying him, guiding him toward the porch. The man shouted for someone inside, and a woman appeared, phone already pressed to her ear, speaking urgently to emergency dispatch. David was lowered into a chair, the world tilting as he tried to keep his eyes open. He heard fragments of the conversation: stab wound, losing blood, send someone fast. The neighbor pressed a wad of clean towels to his side, telling him to keep pressure on it. The sirens came eventually, a distant wail that grew louder until red and blue lights splashed across the trees. Paramedics moved quickly, their voices calm but brisk as they checked his pulse, his breathing, the depth of the wound. They loaded him onto a stretcher, the cold air giving way to the sterile warmth of the ambulance. The ride was a blur of oxygen masks, the prick of 4 lines, and the steady rhythm of the heart monitor beside him. At the hospital, the overhead lights burned bright as they wheeled him into surgery. The faces above him were hidden behind masks, their words clipped and efficient. The last thing he remembered before the anesthesia took hold was the steady beeping and the feel of hands working quickly to keep him here. When he woke, the world was muted, his body heavy with medication. Pain radiated from his side in dull waves. A nurse was there, adjusting the lines, speaking softly about how he'd been lucky. The blade had missed anything that would have killed him instantly. He was in the intensive care unit, they told him, and the next few days would be critical. It was on the second day that the police came. Two detectives stood at the foot of his bed, their notepads ready. They asked him to recount what had happened, and though his voice was weak, he told them everything he could remember. The argument, the way she had looked at him, the knife, the way she had taken his car and left. They nodded, filling in details, asking about her past, her release, their relationship. He could see the conclusions forming in their minds, but they didn't say them aloud. When they left, one of them told him they had already issued a warrant and were tracking the car. It didn't take long. She was found 2 states away, driving his vehicle and using his credit cards. When the officers approached, she didn't run. She stepped out of the car calmly, as if she had been expecting them. They found the knife still in her belongings, wrapped in a towel, the stain faint but visible. Back in custody, her demeanor was as cold as it had been in the cabin. She claimed she had acted in self-defense, that David had been threatening her. The detectives didn't buy it, not with the evidence they had, not with the statements from the neighbors and the crime scene. The news reached him in the hospital late one afternoon. A detective stopped by to let him know she had been charged with attempted murder and theft, among other things. She was being held without bail, awaiting trial. David listened, nodding slowly, the weight of it settling over him. He had survived. The thought came to him simply, without fanfare, but it was followed quickly by another. He had also lost something he couldn't name. It wasn't just the trust or the future he'd imagined. It was the version of himself who had believed in her without question, who had been willing to step away from everything for the life they had promised each other. Lying in that hospital bed, the monitors humming softly beside him, he understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Winter had settled in by the time Samantha's trial began. The courthouse stood gray against a low sky, its steps slick with frost. David arrived each morning with a slow, deliberate gait, his body still carrying the stiffness from the injury. He wore a dark coat, his scarf pulled high, and kept his eyes ahead as he passed the reporters gathered near the entrance. Their questions, sharp, eager, slid off him unanswered. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than the air outside. The hum of quiet voices filled the space until the bailiff called for order. When Samantha was brought in, shackled at the wrists, she moved with the same controlled grace he remembered from their first conversations. She didn't look at him. Not once. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her expression unreadable. The prosecution laid out their case in careful, methodical strokes. Photos of the cabin, the knife, his blood on the floor. The testimony of the neighbors who had helped him that night. The receipts showing her use of his credit cards in the days after. Each piece landed like a stone in a growing pile, building a picture of intent and betrayal. David was called to the stand midway through the trial. His voice was steady at first, recounting the events in plain terms, but as he spoke about the moment she turned with the knife, the memory cut deeper than he expected. The quiet in the room felt heavy, the eyes of the jury fixed on him. When he stepped down, he avoided looking toward her table. Her defense painted a different story. They spoke of her difficult past, her time in prison, the years of control and mistrust from others in her life. They suggested that night had been a breaking point, that she had acted in fear. But the evidence was strong, and the prosecution pushed back at every turn, reminding the jury of her actions after the attack, leaving him bleeding on the floor, taking his wallet, driving away without calling for help. On the final day, the air in the courtroom felt tight, as though everyone was holding the same breath. The jury filed back in, their expressions neutral. The foreman read the verdict, guilty on all major counts. There was no visible reaction from Samantha. She stood still, her gaze fixed ahead, as the judge pronounced her sentence. Decades in prison, the exact number echoing against the wood-paneled walls. David felt no surge of triumph, no satisfaction in seeing her led away. There was only a quiet finality, the closing of a chapter he had never imagined writing. As she passed, their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was nothing there, not anger, not remorse, not even recognition. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a solid, final sound. The months that followed moved slowly. Physical recovery came first. Rehab sessions to rebuild strength, follow-up appointments, the careful monitoring of the scar that traced along his side. But the deeper healing was less visible. Nights were the hardest. Sleep came in restless stretches, interrupted by flashes of memory, the glint of steel, the sudden heat of pain, the sound of her footsteps leaving. Friends tried to pull him back into the rhythms of ordinary life. Invitations to dinners, to weekend trips, to small gatherings. He accepted some, declined others. Crowds made him uneasy, and quiet moments sometimes left too much space for his mind to wander. He filled the days with work, different work now, away from the world of locked doors and watchtowers, and with small tasks that kept his hands moving. He sold the apartment they had shared, unable to walk through those rooms without feeling the echo of her presence. He found a smaller place on the edge of town, a single-story house with a narrow porch and a patch of yard that caught the afternoon sun. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that had once felt like absence but now began to feel like peace. Every so often, he would think about the version of himself who had waited outside those prison gates, believing he was starting the best chapter of his life. He didn't hate that man. He understood him. The hope, the need to believe in something pure after years of routine and disappointment. But he also knew that man had been blind to truths that were there all along, just beneath the surface. Letters came for a while, sent from the women's facility where she was serving her sentence. He didn't open them. He kept them in a drawer, sealed and untouched, their weight small but constant. Eventually, they stopped arriving. Life didn't return to what it had been before, but it found a new shape. Mornings began with coffee by the window, the light spilling across the table. Evenings ended with a book or the hum of the radio. Some days were heavy, but others carried a lightness he hadn't expected to feel again. He carried the scar with him, a line on his skin and a mark on his memory, but it no longer defined him. It was a reminder, sharp and permanent, of where trust had led him once. And though he would never forget the woman who had turned on him in the quiet of a cabin kitchen, he knew that her place in his story was finished. What lay ahead was his alone to decide.